Cheers.
Welcome to Sparta. Today's guest is Kasia Fudakowski, who's currently on a residence in Stechlin at a very cozy fireplace that you unfortunately cannot see right now. Hi, Kasia.
Hi.
Hi, nice to have you here. As always, we have the talk and afterwards the Q&A session, and we post the link into the video description in the video and as a comment under the video. And with that, I give you the word. Thanks a lot, and I go into the presentation mode. Now
Okay.
we can start,
Okay. Thank you so much, Pia and Till, for this invitation. As I understood it, you would like me, or there was a request to talk about the book that I've just brought out this year, which is The Role of the Artist, Volume 1. And I thought this would be a good opportunity to kind of structure this talk around the book, to talk a little bit about my work, but also as I'm an artist on a residency, I feel like a cliche. So I'm going to kind of focus on the works that I have made over the last 10, 15 years, which kind of deal with that idea of the artist and the role of the artist. So the book was actually supposed to be a catalogue. I was very lucky to receive the Günther Peil Stiftung grant 3 years ago, which is one of those fantastic grants that doesn't expect anything particular from you. And so I had 2 years of support, and then had the opportunity to have an exhibition in Düren at the Leopold Holsch Museum, and then also make a catalogue. And I thought this time I'm going to just make a straight catalogue, because in the past I've often made catalogues, but they kind of sabotage my needs as an artist to apply for things, for further grants and applications, etc. And so I thought this time I'm just going to have a really straight catalogue. I'm going to invite 2 brilliant writers, curators, to write about my work. I'll have a whole bunch of images, and I'll be able to use this catalogue to, forward my career. But then Corona came, lockdown, and I realized that if I wanted to look over 15 years of work, I wouldn't really have the money to pay a curator to go into into all of these works. So I started writing myself, and I wrote, this such and such a project, Fudakowski was considering so-and-so. And then it started to become obvious to me how absurd that is to write in the third person. And I thought, why is it that in art texts, there's very rarely the first person, the artist writing, I was thinking. And I think it's because it's an awkward feeling to read the direct thoughts of the artist. I think that mostly people need a little bit of distance between what the artist was thinking on the day-to-day and the artwork itself. But when I realized that there was that discomfort and maybe awkwardness, then I realized that's exactly what I want to do. And this book kind of came out of that. So it's, what's the last bit?
Or maybe just go back to this, yeah.
The previous...
Yeah, like 10 seconds or something. No big deal.
Okay. Okay. So this book is the result of very many influences, which I talk about in the book. But the three kind of main influences that influence the structure: Cervantes, which I reread early on in lockdown, and I really love that idea of Don Quixote as a character, almost like an artist, in the fact that he has this delusion about chivalry and being a knight errant, and slowly his madness becomes so convincing that everyone around him also starts to reflect his madness, much like an artist will try to kind of make their own rules, which seem maybe absurd and mad and not usual, but then if they're convincing enough, they start to also have that reflected back at them. So that was this, there was a way of like pulling a Don Quixote as a character into the book. And then Kierkegaard's Either Or is a huge influence on my work and also on this book. And what I love about Either Or is this kind of binary between the ethical life and the aesthetic life. And I think what's brilliant about that book is giving the reader the choice kind of activates the reader. And the third kind of biggest influence was Olga Tokarczuk's book Flights, which I read 2-3 years ago. And that's kind of, it's not the only book that uses that structure, but it does very, very efficiently and brilliantly use fragments. And so the whole book is made up of fragments, which means that you can read the book, you can kind of pick it up in various different places and read the book differently. And that is reflected in the 3 introductions. So the first introduction is directly taken from Don Quixote, from Cervantes's introduction, in which he kind of pledges his allegiance to the King of Spain. And in the same way, I'm pledging my allegiance to Gunther Peil, who is the benefactor who allowed this project to happen. And the contents pages reflect that kind of Knights of Chivalry, this very idealistic view of the artist. The second introduction is a much more critical introduction about the artist and their financial background and what it means to get a grant and what it also means to write in the first person in the art world. And then the contents page reflects that kind of much more critical take on the chapters, the same chapters. And the third introduction is a very naive, personal introduction to the book, and the contents pages are also very personal. And I think I would like to read you that introduction because it's a nice way of setting up how personal this book is. So, introduction: the role of the artist. On one of our first dates, an ex-boyfriend said to me, in an unexpectedly sardonic tone, "So you call yourself an artist?" It made me laugh and then immediately question the very foundations of who I am. When my parents used to introduce us as children to their friends, they had no trouble with my brother. He'd bound up and engage without needing any go-betweens. I was painfully shy, averse to touch, and would hide under my mother's skirts, or if I could, dash under the table, snot dripping from my blocked sinuses, eyes akimbo, avoiding contact. My mother would smile apologetically. I'm sorry, she's an artist. If she'd said, I'm sorry, she's a fireman, things might have turned out very differently. Learning to associate social discomfort with being an artist, I was helpfully handed a framework through which to deal with it. A framework which grafted art and life together so seamlessly they became entirely codependent. Becoming an artist became the explanation for an identity before it was a job. I won't read the last bit. So that gives you kind of idea of the one of the approaches that you can read this book through. What you can probably guess from that introduction is that I'm very interested in awkwardness, discomfort, self-sabotage, and shame. These are some of my major topics. I would sort of describe the way that I work is kind of finding something, observing something funny or experiencing something funny, and then trying to understand, investigate why that was funny, and following it until it becomes somehow horrific. And I get completely lost into the horror of the thing I've created. And the only way out is to then again find the comedy, find the mechanisms, and laugh. And I kind of, in order to explain that better, more succinctly, I came up with my own definition, which is to define my work as comic. Comic is a non-linear behavior, logic, or practice, which employs comic mechanisms to unravel a perceived reality in its discernible comic and horrific elements. It is never benign, conclusive, or beholden to the idea of success. Its target is most commonly self-implicating. It is indebted to freedom and obligated to risk. And that definition is sort of knowingly arrogant, I guess, because I think, you know, as artists, one does have to spend a lot of time wondering and thinking about what one's approach is and how one can actually explain that to somebody else. And the reason that I think I have come up with this definition is partly through various influences. And one of them is Andy Kaufman. And many people are very familiar with Andy Kaufman, yet he's still described as a cult figure. He was active in the 1970s and 1980s in New York and LA, American comic, but he would never have described himself as a comic. He described himself as a song and dance man. And what I find so interesting about Kaufman was this way that he had many different characters that he would play, but never really give away who the real Andy was. So you can see in the top right, his character is Tony Clifton, who he never admitted to being. So it's all kind of speculation, but it's pretty clear that this is one of his characters who would play the provocateur and be kind of outlandishly outrageous, say everything that nobody wanted to hear. A lot of people have connected that character to Trump, in fact. And then he, at one point, announced that he was the female wrestling champion of the world. And we use these kind of huge stadium events to really target and bait third wave feminism, I think, of the time, the 80s, to wrestle women. And I find that really interesting and also kind of problematic. Here he is performing on Letterman as Andy, but in fact, instead of doing a song, I think he was supposed to sing an Elvis. He had a pitch perfect Elvis impression, but instead of doing that, he went up onto this stool and starts talking about how his wife has left him and that he has no money, and he would very much appreciate money from the audience. And you never really had this feeling of like security with him. And what I love is that his comedy or his act always forced the audience to decide themselves if they were going to find it funny or not. And it's that decision that I'm really interested in. Here he is wrestling. And I looked into this side of his work quite a bit because it bothered me, because he does shout very sexist, awful things at his audience, and women do come out of the audience to fight him out of anger. But you can see that he's really getting off on it, that he's enjoying that physical contact. And I find it very kind of uncomfortable. It's not a perfect feminist story. It's a pretty difficult. I mean, I think after my research, I think he was really, really enjoying the physical contact. But also what he's very interested in wrestling, which I find interesting, is this idea of kayfabe. And kayfabe is a kind of code word which wrestlers use amongst each other to basically wink and say that, we're keeping the story up. Or if somebody is coming in who's not from the wrestling world, kayfabe is a code word to let the other wrestler know that someone from the outside world is coming in. And I think he used that kind of complicity to create this kind of world where reality would come into it and change it, yet it was fiction continually kind of morphing and changing so that you never got that feeling of relief. And apart from Andy Kaufman, back in 2011, I came across this book, which is Concrete Comedy, an alternative history of 20th century comedy, written by David Robbins. And he has a long section on Andy Kaufman. But what I learned through this book, which is a fantastic kind of carving out of a new history of the 20th century, where he's made up his own rules for what concrete comedy is. And he goes through and picks out various elements to build up his history. And one of those people that he decides to kind of base his idea of concrete comedy on is Karl Valentin, who I wasn't aware of as an English-Polish person, but Germans are much more aware of him. But I read about his Panopticon, which I'm not sure so many people are aware of. So Valentin was a cabaretist working in between 1911 and 40, towards the end. And he was a regular cabaretist with his sidekick Liesl Karstadt, who you can just see under his arm there. We'll get back to her. But at some point, he decided to take over the basement of a hotel in Munich, the Hotel Wagner, and create a kind of Gruselkammer, a kind of horror train, ghost train that people could walk into and experience these object jokes. And this is what David Robbins refers to as concrete comedy. So it's sort of objects that are not sculptures because they are not made for their aesthetic qualities, and they're not props because they don't need to be activated by an actor, but they are in themselves concrete comedy. They have a kind of latent ability to own a joke. And he talks about them as objects with ambition. And this example here on the right, Ofen, keine Ausstellungsprojekt, steht nur so da. Oven, not part of the exhibition, it's just here. And this piece blew my mind. I think it's this fantastic kind of triangulation between the object, the title, and the context. And that was incredibly exciting to me. So in 2011, it's 2011, I don't know why it says 13. I did the exhibition Smile at Kert Gallery in Berlin. And it was kind of not my first solo show, but my first solo show with the gallery. And I knew that nobody had seen me perform before. I had never performed before, so I had no idea how I would be, so no one else could know how I would be. And sort of using the influence of Kaufman and combining it with this idea of concrete comedy, objects that have their own kind of ability to tell a joke. I combined the two and wrote a performance which involved talking about the boundaries in comedy and how jokes make them visible. And I started with very open jokes that everybody could kind of understand, and then got more and more obscure the more time went on. And as I was telling these jokes, I would activate various elements of these sculptures. And this was, for example, the shirt that I wore that then, when I told the final joke, which you can see here at the end, my shirt matched this roll blind that I pulled down. And this was the kind of first time that I was combining comedy, stand-up comedy, performance, and sculpture. And what was great about this this performance was that right at the end, you can see that there's something, basically, that box falls on my head. And this was unexpected. And it was just badly installed by my gallerist. I take no responsibility for it whatsoever. But having that kind of something like fall on my head was very similar to the response that I got after the performance, which was, I thought I was dealing with, the mechanics of humor and talking about the boundaries with art within comedy and jokes. And the comments that I got were about how brave it was that I, as a woman, had tried to tell some jokes. And so I wrote about that very briefly in a section called Blindness. First, I got an email. I received an email from 2 curators who had seen my work, inviting me to produce something for an exhibition they were organizing. Quote, "We think that you are developing a somewhat post-colonial queer discourse aimed at the crisis of ethnological museums, the blind ends of feminism, and ironizing the persistent anthropocentrism of our culture." Next section, the artist as agenda. For all my attempts at an intricate construction, layering comic theory over comic devices, what I had failed to notice was how I had apparently bravely played with gender, which I learned, according to the audience feedback, everyone else had. And so in the same way that kind of you create something and then you have to take on the feedback or it's reflected back on you, I suddenly was confronted with this idea of that, that my gender was far more important than what I was trying to do. So the next project I did was called, well, not the next, one of the next was called Pessimistin. And maybe, I'll just say that I thought that I could use that kind of expectation and the stereotype of the maybe brave but weak female performing. I tried to use that in this performance, and you can just play the 2-minute clip.
I don't want to talk about space. I feel like my parents and my parents' parents' generation had such a direct relationship with it that I don't have, and I don't have any personal experience to share with you. But at the same time, I'm not going to go on about Facebook and tweeting. I don't want to talk about my personal life. Just ignore that music. It's not part of the performance. I don't talk about my personal life or my relationship with my father. Or make any references to my personal appearance. I don't want to talk about my need to provoke, being in constant battle with my need to be loved. I'm not even going to use, not going to use my own voice.
So relax. Guys, relax. Close your eyes. Guys, close your eyes. the glass half full, or is the glass half empty? Where's the glass?
Okay, thank you. So that was a piece called Pessimistinnen, which became part of my Fraustellung series, as it became more clear what I was kind of working with, which began with Enthusiastinnen, then I did Pessimistinnen, Stoikerinnen, and Sexistinnen, finally. And around about this time, I discovered for myself the artist Lee Lozano. And she's been a huge influence on my work since I kind of discovered her for myself. And such a kind of huge influence that I became very, very obsessed with her. I went to New York to try to talk to the estate of Lee Lozano and force them to show me her notebooks. And I would like to just read you the first kind of the moment where she got me. Genitals, from the chapter Wrestling. They lured me in, her magic mix of drills, guns and cocks, teeth, tits and testicles, staplers, spanners, cigarettes, oily wrenches, hammers and screws, slits and clits, sockets, cunts and cum, bolts and holes, plugs and ears, fist-clutching pearls, nuts, thumbs, bums, and dirty, filthy puns. Lee Lozano's psychosexual drawings and paintings are violent, cruel, erotic, and goddamn funny. They're aggressive, they elbow, they take up space, buzz and ooze. They nailed me. When I first saw them close up, like celebrities, they were much smaller in real life. But unlike celebrities, perhaps, they lived up to what I had imagined. I'd never felt this way before about anyone, let alone a painter. What a hole poker, what a joker, what a blast of fresh air. Then I found out about her conceptual works from the late 1960s, works where she yanked, knotted, and twisted the line dividing art and life. I tripped headfirst into her unraveling. And so it was her language pieces that really kind of got me in. And there are two pieces which are kind of quite well known. One is called Boycott Piece, in which she, it's up there in the top right, in which she decided never to speak to women again. And her final piece, Dropout Piece, in which she dropped out of the art world. And Boycott Women is, for me, it's a bit like Karl Valentin's Oven. It just doesn't really like exist, and yet it's the most kind of world-changing piece of art I think I've ever experienced. And it's both horrific and sad and hilarious at the same time. And that kind of like Lee Lozano's ability to be this kind of radical self-saboteur of her own self, I find really interesting. And that piece is so kind of economic in that there's no videos of her not talking to women. It's all kind of just exists in us imagining how a female artist could function by not talking to people. And then Dropout Piece is kind of the dessert on top of that, where you have to imagine, did she continue not talking to women, or was that kind of her out of the art world? And the obsession with Lee Lozano and Andy Kaufman forced me into making this work, which was Sexistinnen, which was at the invitation to, well, I had to apply to do statements in Basel. And when I found out that you're automatically put forward for the Basel, the Baloise Art Prize for 35,000 franken, I realized that the judges will only spend 5 minutes in the booth. And I kind of was just so outraged by the fact that I would spend 6 months working on something for it to be judged in 5 minutes. And so the whole proposal, which I made together with my gallerist, was in order to sabotage that. And it was kind of at the same time that I was realizing that the art world was in a certain way rigged against women, that female artists were not reaching the highest prices in auction. and were much less represented and stuff in the art world. And Basel is kind of, of course, the center of that. But I thought in a comic strategy, the best thing is always to self-implicate, to point the finger at myself. And so I started looking at internalized sexism rather than sexism in the greater, in the art world. And internalized sexism is generally asserted to fall into 4 categories. One is assertions of incompetence. There's a competitiveness between women, the construction of women as objects, and the invalidation or belittling of women. And I took those sort of 4 tenets of sexism as my starting point to, again, make sculptures that would be somehow activated by myself and my gallerist for that 5-minute performance when the jury came to judge the work. And I think you can, play the second clip.
What is this?
Wow.
Jenny, what is this?
Wow, this is pretty cool.
It's not the file that I sent you.
What do you mean it's not a file?
Oh my god. I sent you 3 of the same image by WeTransfer. This is the white balance image.
Actually, I do all.
I need the same contract. Sorry.
Jenny, can you just wait?
Well, it's midnight. I don't think I can wait
I
anymore.
think this is a little
They're
bit
gonna
more
close.
important. Is it working? Can you just be careful? I've just fixed these whole
Hey, I
cables.
just cleaned this.
Yeah.
You should be down finishing the film.
No, I'm waiting for the WhatsApp from my brother.
Yeah, but I mean the committee is coming in 10 minutes.
What do you mean the committee is coming into
The prize?
It's tomorrow, Jenny.
No, it's today.
It's tomorrow.
It's today.
Hi,
Hello.
I'm the artist.
Hello.
Hi, nice to meet you. It's a bit embarrassing actually because my film is not. It's really complicated, like the codec or something. The DVD player is not working. This is explaining this piece. So this is a hurricane.
It's
Which is,
called Claudette.
It's called Carol.
This is actually also based on her body. It was a kind of self-portrait of the artist.
It's not based on my body.
Well, it
But
does
it's
represent a very strong woman.
It's what I call like endurance weaving because it takes such a long time. It's like 100 hours of just weaving this
I
hurricane.
think it's also very feminine in the way that it's all handmade by the artist. So it has really this connotation of the repetition of the work, as well as the gate. She did everything.
Wow, it looks
It's nice,
It looks completely.
You didn't fix it. Sorry.
Can you turn it off?
Yeah, I mean it's supposed to stay actually, but
Well, I need to fix.
I think it went really well.
Quite well.
Yeah, very well.
Yeah. So of course we didn't win the Balois prize, which was sort of our intention, but also nevertheless painful. But I want to kind of go back to the book and talk about the joke gap. And the joke, it being a feminist issue. Well, I'll read this. The joke A joke can be seen as expendable social capital. Historically, a woman first had to establish herself as serious before she could invest in a joke. This is a point I have already made once, but it seems worth repeating. This is in the section of the book called Repetition. And there we go. And kind of as a quick sort of side story, this is a woodcut. Throughout the book, there are these woodcuts which kind of define each chapter. And the first picture I showed you before of Karl Valentin with Liesl Karstadt under his elbow. And this image really disturbed me. But I'd always been interested in Valentin. But because of this image, I started to ask, who is this woman? And sort of through the writing of this book, realized that there was this whole story of Liesl Karstadt, who was his sidekick, his collaborator, his agent, his co-writer, his co-actress, who had performed on almost every performance that he had also performed in throughout their careers. And she's kind of just forgotten by history. And I'm really interested in the idea of it being a trope to go back in history and find women that were underappreciated at the time. And that works for mathematicians and scientists and writers because we have evidence of what they did, which makes sense to us today. But it's much harder to go back in time and see comedy and try to understand it with today's eyes. So honoring Liesl Karstadt became something of a kind of quest in the book. And she was a real pioneer because she played so many different roles. And in fact, the relationship that she had with Valentin enabled her to play male roles and therefore a lot more kind of power positions. And the relationship was, I think, quite fraught and a classic example of the genius male sort of taking up the space, enabling but also taking up the space that she could have filled. And it's made me think a lot about kind of emotional labor and the necessity of kind of repetition. And I want to read you briefly the last extract, which is the comic versus tragic. The difference between the comic and the tragic hero or heroine is marginal. Both experience tragedy, but where the tragic hero or heroine either succeeds or dies trying, the comic hero heroine neither succeeds nor dies. Instead, they get up, brush themselves off, and start the whole process again. It's at these moments both the horror and the comic sides of the scenario are revealed. I think I won't go into the philosophy behind there because it might get a little bitty over Zoom. But finally, the last piece that I want to talk about is, so after Basel and the success and failure of that piece, I realized the one thing that you must not do in the art world is go to another art fair and show exactly the same work that you have just shown, because one, it proves that you did not sell it. And two, it's a kind of, it's like dating, it's desperate. And so I asked my gallerist if it would be at all possible if I could do exactly that. And so 3 months later at Artissimo, I showed exactly the same presentation, but did a new performance, which I think is the kind of the most self-sabotaging artistic, the role of the artist performance I've ever done. So maybe you can just play that. And I think I will leave it there.
Dear art world, let me explain. Earlier this year at Art Basel Statements, you gave me the chance to win the prestigious Baloise Prize. I don't know why, but I messed up on purpose, thinking it was a statement of some kind. I tricked you. I filmed you secretly. But I thought that's what you wanted. Give me a second chance. And I won't need a third. I don't want to be an outside artist. I'm sorry. I love you. If anyone can just spare a few coins and a little bit of change for the transport costs and maybe a sandwich or two. This is a not-for-profit section of the art fair, and you can imagine how expensive that can be.
All right. Thank you so much. Let's continue with the Q&A in 10 minutes, so at 20:50. And yeah, see you then. See you soon. Ciao, ciao.